It is the largest engineering society in the world. The Vehicular Technology Society is that special interest group in the IEEE that deals with vehicular and personal communications, automotive electronics, and light rail. Primarily in this particular conference this year has been very, very heavily in the area of personal communications and cellular telephone. Just as an aside, as we speak right now, the world's first microcell cellular telephone system is in operation in this hotel. If you noticed at the Cossack out in the other area, Southwestern Mobile Technologies and AT&T have 3 microcells running in this hotel. If you have a personal telephone, cordless cellular, it will, when you walk into this building, be handed off from the macrocell system outdoors to the microcell system inside, and you will be handed off from cell to cell as you walk through the halls. This is a world's first, and we're very, very pleased that they were able to pick our conference to demonstrate it to the world. This evening we have I wanted to cover one other thing. The 41st VTS conference, I think, was 566 registrations to date. This is the largest VTS conference ever. Next year it will be in Denver. And we have had 168 technical papers presented yesterday, today, and tomorrow. In addition to that, the IEEE / American Society of Mechanical Engineers Joint Rail Conference is being held in the inn next door. They run today, tomorrow, and Thursday. Okay, I lost what day it is. A lot of you are hams, a lot of you are not. Some of you are here from the conference, a lot of you are not. I took the liberty of co-sponsoring this old-time radio night with the Radio Club of America and the Quarter Century Wireless Association. The Radio Club of America is the world's society. It was originally founded in 1909. We have with us this evening the president of the Radio Club of America, Fred Link. In addition, the Missouri chapter of the Quarter Century Wireless Association is also here and has equipment on display. The Quarter Century Wireless Association, to be eligible for membership, you must have been a ham 25 years ago, not continuously. Okay, it's also a very old organization, and most of us old-timers, and I don't feel like an old-timer, but I know I am, are members of that. We've got there's some equipment. I was hoping that more folks would bring stuff, but it looks like there's enough here to at least look at. Well, I have this evening the opportunity to present to you, and I'm going to tell you a little bit, be embarrassed, two-way radio industry. Al Gross, who is the founder of the Personal Communications or Citizens Band. Al Gross invented Citizens Band. Stu Meyer is an old-timer in the area of business land mobile radio. Charlie Higginbottom is also here. Charlie, if any of you fellas have old enough licenses, you probably see Charlie Higginbottom's signature on the bottom of some of your FCC licenses, or at least the rubber stamp. Because I know he didn't sign them all himself. So, pardon? Uncle Charlie, okay. I'm not going to make him stand up and talk or anything like that, but I would like Roger Madden here to raise his hand. Roger Madden is from Tallahassee, Florida, and he is the president of the society. He's the guy who we all report to as far as this big conference is concerned. What we're going to do is take and have a slideshow that will be put on by Stu and by Fred and Al. I don't know what they have planned. I have not seen it. After we get done with the slide presentation and so on, at that point in time, we may break and go get a Coke or a cup of coffee or a glass of water or whatever. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these fellows that are basically walking radio history. And when I say walking radio history, not only in the land mobile field, Fred, for instance, as a kid, when he was first on the air at the YMCA, ran Spark transmitter. Am I right? You worked Spark when you were a kid before you got your license with the Y. Okay, so he was on the air using Spark. So that predates most all of us. Well, I'm sure they didn't, okay. And you told me when you went on CW you had to change your call because they wouldn't talk to you. Okay. So, okay.
I don't know how many of the people are amateurs here to know that it was almost a disgrace to have a CW set.
Okay, he would have.
Operator, you were definitely the operator.
For you, okay, for those who didn't hear him, he said when CW first came along, it was a disgrace to operate CW. Okay, only the real operators still work Spark. Okay, they weren't on CW. So without an awful lot else, I'm going to get my face out of the way here. Let somebody bring. Is the slide projector stuff all set up, Stu? Okay, you get a remote control or whatever you need. Okay, the remote control is there. Here is a microphone to talk with. You can sit right in front and say what's going on or whatever. And after we break, by the way, I'm going to get all these old timers up here on the dais together. Just sit them down, give them microphones, and have them start telling stories about old time radio. With a little luck, we may be done by midnight.
I thought you said we're going to serve breakfast here.
Well, that's it. If Fred and Al get going together, that will be the case.
Got a short fuse here.
Short fuse?
I mean, yeah.
Swank fella, how do we get the cable to run around so we can reach? What do we have to find?
What's the matter? Yes, too short?
Too short at one end.
Can you pull it out from under, or what?
That's the advantage of having a professional soundman.
Can you come out here somewhere?
Yeah.
Hold it loose whenever they there.
Found it yet?
Just to be able to.
What? Oh, okay.
You want to thank you for the.
Pull on it. Just pull up.
Hang on a second. I forgot to do one of the little things.
Okay. Oh, just a second.
For those of you that are hams and are not here for the conference, Fred is W2ALU, Stu is W2GHK, and Al is W8PAL. Charlie, what's your call?
What is this?
You can see how active he is on the air.
I tell you how I know it's the WB3 what?
DLT.
WB3ELT? DLT, WB3DLT, okay.
Remember, like bacon, lettuce, and tomatoes. Thank you, Al. Well, I want to pressure with the fact that you're here to get the straight though tonight. Can we have the first slide, or the slide projector turned on, please? And lights turned down. You know, Fred Link hasn't seen this particular version of the slideshow. I said to him, I said, Fred, mail me some pictures or send me some pictures by a certain date, and I'll convert them to slides. And so a few of the slides you may see may reveal a bit of Fred's character, but we will get to that.
That says it's not a horse.
That's not a horse, that's right. So we are here to give you the straight story and not confuse you. Anyway, you know, in the beginning there were smoke signals. And then came the Fred M. Link Mark I base station. And then the Mark II base station. This is a deceased member of the Vehicular Technology Society. I'll ask Fred in a moment or two to tell how you recognize this CW signal on the air. This is Dave Talley, back in 19-something or other. W2 Papa Foxtrot. I guess he was just 2PF back then. And Fred had a very distinctive way of recognizing Dave on the air in CW. Fred, what was it?
I don't know exactly what you're shooting for in this, but I knew him because when he used a key, he had a peculiar fist that was so unintelligible that when you heard him talk, you said that had to be Dave Talley, and it was usually Dave Talley. Is that what you want me to say?
That's the story. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot goes. Give me this time. All right. Dave Talley had a contact with me when I first went on the air with CW. Of course, that was the first time I knew what it was to work outside of York, Pennsylvania. I mean, York, Pennsylvania was about the limits of my Sparknet, which was 3OV, an original 3OV. It was Sparknet. And I surreptitiously went into CW because I felt that I was never going to get much further than 30 miles with the Sparkset, and went into CW. But I couldn't do this and downgrade the call letter 3OV. I had to apply for a new call, and that was 3BVA by that time. And one of the first contacts I had, which was later confirmed by Dave to be his first DX contact he had from up in Long Island, was with Dave Talley. But you see, we didn't have voice at that time, and I had to depend on understanding his code, and that was a real mystery. I mean, because he had a staccato type of transmission, a jerky fist, so forth, and I never saw this man until they had this first or the second AARL convention at the Edgewater Beach Hotel in Chicago. And this would have been about 1923, I believe. I believe that would be the date. And I hitchhiked from York to Chicago, and I can't remember how I could have ever done something like that, but I did it. And I went to the Edgewater Beach Hotel, and went in the hotel, and a person came across the corridor and came up to me. He said, well, are you 3BVA? And I said, yeah, you must be Dave Talley, 2PF. He said, oh, yeah, I'm Dave Talley. And that's just exactly the same. Only because of the way his voice sounded, just exactly the way he sounded when he used the key. And any of you people, and there's a lot of people in this room that have communicated with Dave Talley, you know that I'm telling absolutely gospel truth on that one.
Well, you wouldn't say otherwise, would you, Fred? And this is?
You got it backwards, that's one thing.
Well, I'm not going to turn it around now.
No, I understand. I'm trying to figure out what it is. I think it's one of my... it's one of my transmitters in the early days. This would be in about the 1924 period while I was going to college. It's out of focus, but outside of that, that's the 2ALU. This is the 2ALU transmitter that Johnny Knight and I had that we built and entered in the first major DX contest of ARL, and that was in 1927. And the objective was that we were going to win the contest, not just go in it. And since both of us worked for the AT&T indirectly, I worked for New York Tel and John worked for Western Electric, we were able to steal enough components that we were able to put together a transmitter. Our problem was that we lived in the YMCA in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Any of you people know Prospect Park, and if you know Brooklyn, you know Prospect Park. We lived there, and as we very quietly put together this transmitter and receiver, toward the day that this contest was going to open, we got our rooms moved from the lower floor till we were up on the top floor of the 9th Avenue YMCA. We finally put up an antenna, which up to that time had not been up, and simply was a wire strung between the YMCA and a Catholic church on the corner about a block away. And obviously, it was shock excited. It had no tuning at all. We hadn't the faintest idea how to tune it if we could have tuned it. So that was the transmitter, which was my responsibility, and John worked on the receiver, which was the unit over the side. And unfortunately, that's me sitting in front of all of it. But we had a very good deal going for us. We thought we did for this contest, since John worked a night shift at Western Electric, and I worked the day shift in New York Tel, that we'd come on the air at the most suitable time for about an hour for each one of those segments. The thing is that we had a transmitter that didn't meet all the standards, even in those days. First of all, we had three-phase power source, which was halfway rectified. So we had 180 ICW tone, and since you didn't use crystals in those days, you just had master oscillators, we had back-to-back push-pull tubes, which were a tube type number 206. They were an experimental tube by General Electric, and while I was at Penn State, I was hustling tubes out of General Electric to operate 8XE, so I knew exactly where to go to get them. And we had these tubes back to back. Because of the power sources we had, which was obtained by tapping the elevator shaft feeders, well, now you wouldn't expect us to get much out of 110 outlet on the floor when we had about 8 kilowatts input. And just be reasonable. I mean, but in any case, that was the thing. But we didn't have any way in the world to get a rectifier at that time. Later on, we hustled a three-phased mercury arc rectifier from the BMT subway, which they used them to rectify AC to give them 500 volts at 2,000 amperes or something like that to run streetcars and railway operation. Now you're trying to get me to move on, you see. But in any case, the decrement was so bad on this transmitter that when we went on the air, the whole 7 megahertz band was blanketed. The answer is, in 2 days' time, we were put off the air with the help of the FCC, which got a lot of help from local broadcast people in New York, and from we lost our room in the YMCA, and I knew I was going to get fired from AT&T, and but in spite of that, and only being on the air a couple of days, we officially came in second in that contest for all over the world. We were first, but they disallowed our most important contact, which was with a Norwegian whaler down in the Antarctic. There's no way in the world could confirm this. By the time the contest was over, before this ship could get back and confirm they ever talked to us. But that was the thing. But that was 2ALU at a time when we were, by my own admission, we were the scourge of the broadcast industry. Any of you people from the New York area, you knew what 2ALU was. 180 cycle ICW with decrement that gave you a bandwidth of maybe 200 kilocycles or something like that. In any case, we know that it interfered with broadcast reception in Philadelphia. And that's what really got us off the air.
I got one now. Well, anyway, Fred, at least you guys are pioneers. You fellows, the original pioneers with spread spectrum. There's a radio commentator on the East Coast, Gene Shepard, I think it's K2ORS, who has a banquet speech in which he imitates the CW signal in the 40-meter band. He uses that. And he talks about how he picked some exotic call like 6L6GB and called CQDX at about 5 kc in the band. And every time he stands by, he slides down about a half kilocycle lower. In the meantime, the pack calling him is getting bigger, and he finally moves about 5 kc out of the band, still calling CQDX, and with that he brings the whole pack with him.
Is this my show, or what is this?
Well, you can send me the pictures, Fred.
Well, I know. I can't help that. Well, okay, that's me. This is Johnny Knight. This is important. Now, Johnny Knight was 40X. And I got to know him when he was going to the Naval Academy, and the reason I have a point in this one. And we decided that when we graduated that we'd go to New York to find our fortune and start something. And Johnny Knight at the Naval Academy, at that time, you could go to the Naval Academy, graduate from the Naval Academy, resign the next day, and go into commercial business. So I think it was Johnny Knight's move at this time to change the law. They changed the law about that time, and I think he had something to do with that. So, in any case, this is us in New York in the YMCA, and this is with our at first transmitter, which was before we built our higher power ones. You see, this is something different. This operated on a different basis. But Johnny Knight was 6YY later. But this is the other half of 2ALU, and he's quite some guy. And we were together up until the time that both of us worked at DeForest at one time, and when DeForest was liquidated about 1931, well, John went to NBC and was there, and then he had to move into the Navy during the war, and I think he came out as a captain in the Navy. I'm not sure of that, but in any case, he was very much of a Navy man, and of course he should have been a captain. After all, he graduated from the Naval Academy. It wasn't hard for him to get the promotion. Go ahead. Commander? You're only commander?
Well, this is a few years later. One of the first commercial amateur receivers, the Comet Pro, first commercially produced receivers by Hammerlin. And getting started, and also the pilot had the Wasp and the Super Wasp. The difference was that the Wasp was with a regenerative detector and 2 stages of audio, and the Super Wasp had an RF stage. And a lot of those were used by amateurs, the plug-in coils and that sort of thing. Back then, we used to call them aerials, of course, and not antennas. And this is an article that was written by the famous Don Wallace, W6AM, and he wrote a number of handbooks, small handbooks and articles on how to work the ultimate in working DX. I guess one of the last times I saw Don was on the West Coast when I went out to a DX meeting, and Don was a great one for operating Mobile CW. And he had a bug, not an electronic key, but a bug on the front seat. And this was in Visalia, I guess, or Fresno, California. And he insisted I come back to his ranch that following Monday. And as we tried to get out of the area, I'll never forget, he's going the wrong way down a one-way street with a police car chasing him. And he's simultaneously on CW calling CQDX from the Mobile installation. And John Reinhardt was a very famous name back then with his snake oil and magic. You know, we had, I'll never forget when Jim Lamb invented a noise blanket. It made the front page of the New York papers. You know, young radio amateurs finds a way of eliminating static and that sort of thing. And a lot of those claims were, of course, very much hyped up. And amateur radio, you know, soon got into the world of kind of commercial components, and it became relatively easy to build your own equipment. Lots of magazines to read from, and also newspapers. When I was a youngster going to high school, there were 2 newspapers in New York City, the Herald Tribune, I guess it was the New York Sun, and they had between 6 and 10 pages on the technical side of radio. And they had articles, maybe 3 pages devoted to amateur radio. One popular page was to have your call sign listed being heard in some exotic place, particularly over the Atlantic. And in the broadcast band on, I think it was Thursday night, the broadcast stations used to go off the air for a few hours so that you could listen for stations from out of the country and then send in listening reports and get your name in the paper. My father used to take the headphones off and put them in a fruit bowl on the dining room table so we could all hear some of this stuff. We had lots of, very cheap 5-cent and 10-cent publications on how to build radios, and it's a good thing that those were the prices back then. That's back when the Staten Island ferry was a nickel, so was the New York subway. And I got most of my money for radio by being a caddy. And you got a big 50 cents for 18 holes. And if you had found a big spender, he would buy you a 5-cent glass of lemonade on the 9th hole. Back in the early days of amateur radio and entertainment radio, Manhattan Electric Supply was probably the most famous supply store on the East Coast. And out in this part of the country, you had Walter Ash. I'm sure some of you remember Walter Ash in St. Louis. Is he still in business? No? Okay, well, yes, sign of the times. And, of course, in later years, Lafayette Radio, who went out of business a few years ago, but I remember as a young kid going up to New York City on a rainy day when I couldn't caddy and going up to Lafayette Radio and pestering them with all kinds of questions. Usually ask the same question over and over again. And we had Harrison Radio, and this is a demolished store, a property now, because the World Trade Center sits there, an area called the Cortlandt Street area. And Harrison Radio was, the place to go to. And if you were a New Yorker and you didn't buy your amateur equipment from Harrison, you didn't have it made yet. Anyway, kind of simultaneously with a lot of this stuff, a few years later, commercial broadcasting came along. And as I said, back then, the broadcast stations would go off the air one night a week for chasing DX in the broadcast band. Also, most of the broadcast stations, I guess, they didn't start programming until noon. So the John Wanamaker store in Philadelphia, department store, and their other store in New York also had an AM broadcast transmitter on the roof, and the receivers at each end, and before noon, they would talk back and forth and exchange commercial messages. So that was really the first business radio point-to-point circuit in the AM broadcast band. Radios back then, unlike today's solid-state equipment, required relatively high voltage for the circuits, for the benefit of some of you youngsters. And these batteries, called the B battery, was a collection of 30 1.5-volt flashlight cells inside, and the center tap to get 22.5 volts. But generally speaking, you use either 3 or 4 of these. And automobile radios did the same thing. And an automobile radio automobile installation had a metal container under the running board and would have 2 or 3 or 4 batteries in it. And it wasn't unusual to see a car with a rusted out B battery holder with the batteries dragging along the ground by the wires. Of course, radio became electrified, eliminated batteries. And I had hoped to have 1 or 2 Motorola pictures, which I will talk about later, but since these radios required anywhere from 135 to 180 volts of high voltage and 6 volts of low voltage for the filaments, some of the older battery sets used what was known as a battery eliminator, and that meant they could qualify as being an AC-powered set. And, of course, then later on, all that was done away with, and, radios got much smaller and so forth. In the 36, 37, 38 area, station WLW in Cincinnati kept increasing its power with the permission of the FCC and actually got up to 500,000 watts. And then President Roosevelt inaugurated the first broadcast of WLW. They operated intermittently during the war years, and I remember when I came out of the Navy in 1945, and a couple of years after that, IMAC had these advertisements in QST magazine, which said, when the FCC authorizes super high power, around the country, we're ready, we have the tubes. But the environmentalists got to them on various reasons, and super high power never did get permitted in this country, except for such operations as the Voice of America and so forth. But in a relatively short period of time, 10, 15 years, something like that, you stop and think back, technology then, they rose from about a 30-watt little, peanut whistle up to 500,000 watts. And they had, I guess the first day they started commercial advertising on the 500,000 watt transmitter, the Olson Rug Company placed an ad to send in for catalogs. And the signals were heard during daytime as far away as Honolulu. And the story goes, which they say is a true story, almost shut the plant down. They had to put everybody on answering the mail. Anyway, Fred, you may want to say a few words about this collection of valves.
My pride and joy. I was in charge of the power tube division at a very small but very big name company called DeForest Radio. And a lot of these tubes you people will recognize by looking at the size. Let us say that I was the perpetuator and the designer of these tubes, but of course they never carried my name, which was probably a good thing. But these tubes along the bottom were the water-cooled types, and Jim Evans is here, and I'm trying to get him to admit that a transmitter that I helped build for him or for his organization at the Michigan State Police back in 1928 or 29, was it, Jim? 29, used these water-cooled tubes, which are the ones in the center, which were the 5 kilowatt water-cooled tubes. The one on the end was a 10 kilowatt, was just a open setup. But he couldn't even confirm it, so his memory's as bad as mine. But these tubes at the type was something that I was really very proud of. And again, you say, well, how did I get into the tube business? It wasn't difficult. I mean, because when Alan Dumont hired me, the only thing that I had in my favor was an ability to cause trouble. And that was because of the success or problems with the 2ALU and the interferences it caused, and the fact that the newspaper simply referred to John Knight and Fred Link as two ruffians that should be shot. And so in Alan paying us, and I told a chap who here, I think in the audience tonight, from Bell Laboratory, that this situation with these tubes, I had something in mind. I don't know what it was, because I'm thinking about a situation that had to do with the use of these tubes. The water-cooled tubes. I can go into this part, and maybe that'll bring back the other story. Were very successful in use with this transmitter at WRDS, and a chap came to us and asked us to build a higher power tube, because at that time the only excuse for DeForest making these tubes was the fact that the industry was controlled by RCA, Westinghouse, GE, and let's see, who else? AT&T. From that, they had the use of the Armstrong patents, and anyone who didn't buy equipment from them couldn't buy tubes. They didn't have it. So this was DeForest Radio Company, and at this particular time, the DeForest position as the inventor of the oscillating audion was confirmed by the Supreme Court to be the leading one, and the Armstrong patent of the regenerative circuit, which did the same thing, they both aptly did the same thing, came in second. So the Armstrong position was overthrown, and DeForest became the controlling owners of the patent. That's what made DeForest worthwhile. But now DeForest could make tubes and sell them to other people. And we sold these tubes to Bill Branch. We're down on the Mexican border, and you people who are old enough to know when those Mexican stations were on the air, they really were not Mexican stations. They were pirated American stations that were located just across the border in Mexican territory. XEA, XEB, XEC, XED, and whatever they were called. But you could hear them all over the world. They were some kind of situation. And they all used my tubes, and I consider them like a personal treasure. I mean, Fred Link made them himself, which he didn't, of course.
One story I dropped a few minutes ago, I mentioned Motorola. They sent me some promotional material, and I mentioned the battery eliminators, which would convert a battery-operated radio to house current-operated. And the story I get from Motorola is that the first product that Paul Galvin produced were battery eliminators, which he sold to Sears Roebuck, who in turn sold them to the public, and that was the first product. And the byline of the story was they wish they had never gone into that business originally, because they described what happened as something can be described as the shipments were only exceeded by the returns. Whatever that means. Fred, you sent me this picture that compared to the slide.
I'll have to explain. He won't know how to explain this. I took the picture, but I'll tell you how I happened to be there to do it. This was on Silver Dollar Jim's ranch out in West Texas at Cupadero, and he had a habit of drilling holes for oil, and 9 out of 10 were always dry, and the 10th was about 90% going to go dry. So he hit one that really came in, and so he decided to hold a party for all the executives in Texas, the governor and everyone else, And I believe some FCC people like Nielsen and Betty Farrow and a few old names that some of the old timers will remember were invited to the ranch at that time. We went down to West Texas where this drilling was made, and we're giving you plenty of time to watch the picture. I mean, that's part of the story. And in any case, I told Jim, I said, I want to get a picture of this. And he said, yes, go ahead. And at the time, the girls were wearing the equivalent of raincoats around themselves. And so I said, well, they don't look right. He said, well, what should we do? I said, well, get them to wear their working clothes. So they put on their working clothes, and there they are.
I heard somebody over here said, what's this got to do with radio? Anyway, some early experiments in land mobile radio. I think this is what, 1923? Police vehicle, which you had to be very careful of how you took the corners on a windy day. And this is I guess a U.S.-wide public safety frequency allocation
Can I get in
table.
on this?
Sure, you can get it on it. Go ahead.
Well, I want to tell him because I got that. That was a complete, total number of licensees at the time that this was printed. They were all on one page.
And if you probably can't read it back where you are, but if you look at some of the frequencies, they are just above the broadcast band. And actually, as late as the 50s, you could tune a high end of an AM radio and hear New York City Fire Department and other Monmouth County, New Jersey, and places like that. San Francisco. And then some of these were a little bit high, around 2,500 KC. And there was some below the broadcast band CW frequencies in here, too. What's that, Fred?
That, as far as I'm concerned, could be historically one of the first commercially built transmitters for police service. This was built for Los Angeles Police Department, 250 watts. That was their first purchased radio transmitter for their police department. And that would be about 1928 or 1929.
Is that one of yours?
Yeah. I thought this was a picture of the one that went to WRDS, but Jim wouldn't admit it. What? Well, I mean, I just wanted him to say that because this transmitter was built at DeForest Radio for WRDS, and the order was taken about 1927 or 28 and put on the air, you say, in 1929? Well, okay, you give me wrong by one. But in any case, the history of police communication failed to name this, and that's my fault partially because I was involved in setting up the recommendations, which stations were the pioneers in those days, and I thought that the city of Detroit was honestly entitled to the first recognition as the first commercially produced police radio system. And so the IEEE investigated the thing, and they came up with the same answer that I had guessed at. And so, but here, this is actually built before the stuff in Detroit was worked on. Go ahead now.
Thank you for adding some authenticity to the program, Jim. This is the first two-way installation in the country, licensed two-way.
This is the first two-way using what we called UHF at the time, which was 30 to 40 megahertz, and that's it.
This was AM.
But this was the REL product that was produced for the city of Bayonne, New Jersey, which was, without a question of doubt, the first two-way licensed police radio system in the country.
But in order to demonstrate this to the people who had to, approve the money, the city councilman, Frank Gunther applied for, I guess, the equivalent of an STA back then. They waited and waited, never got an answer from the commission, so they went on the 5-meter amateur band to demonstrate the system, and nobody knew the difference, and they got the order. Now, as we get into going into World War II, to many two-way radio people, this was a standard watt meter kit, a light bulb and a coax connector. And as a matter of fact, for many years, the Motorola instruction manuals told you very carefully how to remove the base and then put some spaghetti over the wires and solder it to the coax connector. And, of course, the amount of brilliance determined how much power output you could get. For many years, the mobile transmitters were powered with dynamotors, which is a motor with a generator in one assembly. And they had a very high inrush starting current. And the joke used to be that, boy, if you had a 6-volt electrical system, you were lucky if you had 5 volts back at the trunk. Anyway, police radio, with its cruising requirement, had a problem with keeping batteries charged. So Elise Neville came up with an alternator back then, in the early 40s, that had a very small pulley. So even when the engine was idling, the generator was turning up fast enough to take care of all the current drain. And Sam McConaughey mentioned at lunch today something like 10 or 15 amperes standby and maybe 50, 60 transmit. The actual inrush current, when you hit the microphone button, or as they say down south when you mash the button, the inrush current was very high. And if you weren't careful setting up the idling of the car, the engine speed, and you hit that mic button, you could actually stall the engine. True story. These had a copper oxide rectifier mounted in front of the radiator, and of course, depending upon the movement of air through the radiator, they keep them cool. And so, if you had a front-end collision with a police car, it usually meant you wiped out the rectifier system. This is the license for what we believe to be the first mobile relay system in this country using link radio equipment. And it was installed in Contra Costa County, California. Fred mentioned the IEEE recognition of Detroit. A few years ago, the IEEE milestones in engineering history provided plaques which have been suitably mounted in places like Detroit for the first radio, which is really a one-way paging system back then, and then two-way in Detroit, in Bayonne rather, and then the AM versus FM test up in Connecticut, and IEEE seemed to have dropped that program for a while, but now they've revived it, and I'm pulling together the material which will honor George Burton, who put this system together, and the control circuitry for this mobile repeater is very complicated. This is the connecting panel between the receiver and the transmitter at the base station end. It was done in low band. And this is give you some idea what a mobile installation looked like back in those days in the driver's seat. And the triple trunk installation, there were various kinds of configurations, but generally speaking, one box was a transmitter and the other box was a receiver. Early dispatching consoles. Back then it was virtually all public safety oriented because you didn't have the wide variety of radio services then that you had today. It was basically public safety and maybe a little bit of something else, and that was about it. And here's a link radio of the 1940s vintage, two-piece, of course, one box of receiver, one box of transmitter. And this is also about the time when the industry was starting to get away from dynamotors to power transmitters and using vibrators. A vibrator, for those of you who don't know, it's not the typical vibrator we hear about today, but back in those days, the vibrator had some electrical contacts and an armature with an interrupter circuit, and it pulsed the DC current going into a transformer, which stepped it up to high voltage AC, and then rectified it, and that replaced, in the case of a receiver, an automobile radio, that replaced the batteries. And then as time went on and vibrators got huskier, and we learned a few things, we applied these to the transmitter and gradually got away from dynamotors. And to give the competition a little bit of a plug, too, you sent me that picture, Fred, so I assume it was okay to include it. You might want to talk about the significance of this one, Fred.
Well, I mean, the significance to me is the fact that this represented the first police communication equipment and the first licensed communication equipment for the state of New Jersey. And this would be about 1931, and this is WPFK, the Bergen County Police. And everyone's dead on that picture except me. But that's the first of it.
That's right. Pharrell Levine, yeah.
What's this?
That was Pharrell Levine.
Yeah, Pharrell Levine.
Yeah.
Pharrell just died about a year ago. Of course, Matt, who was the detective and the head of the police communications division, and in any case, he was a good friend of mine. And the importance of this police radio system at that particular time, policemen themselves were not certain that radio was a good idea, because radio gave Big Brother an opportunity to see when they were drooping off, and then they didn't know whether they wanted radio or whether they didn't. But this department decided they wanted radio and to make a name for themselves, and they went out to get it, but there was never any budget, no money, so they collected the money by going to the house. And I mean, when the police departments collect money, there are ways and ways to do it. But one sure way of doing it is simply going up and saying, look, we'll take very good care of everything that you need from now on. We don't have to worry about your house and everything else, but we need $100 for this. So they happened, and that is how this thing was paid for. But they paid for this system by collecting this money, and I got paid for putting in this system at the rate of maybe $15 at one payment and $240 the next payment, and that's the way the thing worked out. That's how this first police equipment for the state of New Jersey was ever put in service.
Now we're getting into just before World War II, when link radio went into military production. Right?
You want me on that?
Radio. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this, first of all, there's a little bit of history that goes before this. There's a chap who went to the Naval Academy and graduated, because he decided by that time he didn't want to serve in the Navy, and he got an appointment, and he went to the military academy at West Point and graduated. He spent 1 year there and got a graduate status in that, and went into the service. And he was assigned out of Fort Bliss in the 7th Regiment Cavalry. But he had an idea that radio ought to have some place in the military, and he was transferred to Fort Knox. And I had a radio an amateur, by the way, named, what was it? I don't know what his name was. George something, in Louisville, Kentucky. This man, Grant Williams, who was a lieutenant in the military, went to him and said, if you can show me that you have a radio equipment that a policeman without any strict discipline and everything else can handle, I don't see why the military can't use radio. So he borrowed some police AM police equipment from the city of Louisville and tried it out down in Fort Knox. This thing worked fine, except when they turned on the engines on their vehicles, you didn't hear anything. And this was with AM, and so they found they still had a value, so they'd take the vehicles out and park them somewhere and use them as a fixed location transmitter and receiving site. So what happened? They used this equipment for military training and for what the government called these about every 3 or 4 years they have a war games and so forth, and they worked this thing out. And they came to me and said, would I make available to them some of this AM equipment, and so they could use in these tests. They got the equipment. They made a very successful use, because the places where they're having the test from were all fixed locations, and they worked out fine. But it made a very good friend and a very good contact of ours in Grant Williams, this military man. He came to see me about it, and about that time we were playing experimentally with FM equipment. This would be about 1936 or 1937. And they told him that we had something under the table that if it works out, it will have a lot to do with the ignition problem, which was the scourge that kept radio from being successful with the military. And he said, well, what are you going to do about it? I said, well, we just had a man come to visit us that wants us to design and make some equipment, possibly to go into a state police system. That happened to be the Connecticut State Police System. Dan Noble worked with my engineering group, and we developed the equipment, which most of you who have followed the history of this know. This was the first complete installation of an FM system in the world, and that was the Connecticut State Police. But when this happened, I got in touch with a man who was in charge of the Signal Corps Laboratory at Fort Monmouth, and his name was Colonel Roger B. Colton. And I told the colonel that here's something that his own people, meaning Grant Williams, who by this time was a captain in the Signal Corps, and the 7th Regiment Cavalry had become the 7th Regiment Mechanized Cavalry, and with military vehicles that could do it. So what happened, I asked Colton to come to Hartford and come to Connecticut and take a look at this equipment and see whether it wouldn't do what I had said it would do for military. Now, this was by now, about 1938. He brought his whole group, and I don't know whether you have the picture of that, too? All the picture of the whole group? Well, in any case, I took another picture. I might have taken this one, too, but I took the picture of Colonel Colton and his adjutant, which is Major O'Connell, Jim O'Connell, and a whole group of other lieutenants and captains in the service down at Fort Monmouth. They came up to Connecticut, took a look at this equipment. It worked like gangbusters. Couldn't have worked any more perfect than not. On the way back to New York, I rode with Colton. I rode in O'Connell. And the colonel said to me, he said, look, he said, I want this for our mechanized force. What do we have to do to get it? And because the military couldn't just go out and order things at that particular time, and in fact, if they spent over $200 a week out of petty cash, they go on the jig. So I didn't know what to do. I said, well, I'll make the equipment. He said, well, I don't know how you're ever going to get paid for it. He said, but this is the way it has to go. And with that, Grant Williams became a major, and he pushed for the thing. We put this equipment in both the 1st and 2nd Armored Division. But the idea was that the equipment that we put in, which is in this installation that this picture is shown, was for military training, to train people how to use voice communications in the military. At that particular stage, anyone's military career, any communications had to be in code, had to be, which the delays and the decoding, the coding, the decoding, and the delays in transmission and so forth, made it almost an impossible situation to be right. So when you could come along with a system that you had voice communication where you didn't have to train every single man to be a radio operator. That, keep the mic closer to you. What? Keep the mic closer. Well, okay, if you insist. All right. I'm sorry, everybody. I get talking about the story and I forget what else goes with it. But in any case, the thing worked out, and we installed it in both the 1st and 2nd Armored Division, but they didn't go into training like they were supposed to train our forces how to use voice communication, because by that time we had World War II started. So both the 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions were shipped overseas to Ireland and almost immediately reshipped down to the African border and on the African activity against Rommel. Unfortunately, in the fighting down there, the American forces and the British forces combined were pretty badly beaten up at Caspian Pass, and all the equipment and the radio equipment that went with it went down the drain. I mean, it was either captured or demolished at that particular time. But it had some future thing, and many years later at an AFCEA conference in Washington, there was a note on the bulletin board that a certain name, a German name, would like to see me, like to meet with me. And I had the meeting and so forth, and he introduced himself and indicated that he was in charge of communications in the Africa Corps for Rommel, and that he lost his ranking when he couldn't figure out how to work this radio equipment they captured at Castor Pass, and he wanted to meet me because just to let me know that what my effect on the war was. But that's what this is.
Fix this for you real quick. Let's put this on a stand so that you won't have to hold on to it. And then move this chair out of the way.
It's another wartime product of Fred Link's during World War II, the frequency meter. Oh, I went too fast.
That is. Well, that's a frequency meter, and Reed Fisher, who's here from Bell Laboratories, and some of these other people that will recognize this, because we must have made 10,000 of these crazy things, and people keep telling me about them. And they were the basis of finding a frequency, and they were nothing but a master oscillator, no crystals at that time. Then we went later on to upgrade it and put it with crystal monitoring setup.
I might also mention that so the early transmitters, those of you who are hams, early AM police transmitters consisted of a 6L6 tri-TED oscillator, where the plate current of the 6L6 was only exceeded by the crystal current. And that's the reason these frequency meters were acceptable.
Okay. Now, this is something that, of course, one of my pride and joy. The man on the left here is the General Van Dusen, and the chap on the other side, I really believe, is a low echelon person in the Signal Corps, but it could have been Grant Williams. I mean, it looked a little bit like him from the back. But in any case, this was the Amtrak 1, 3, 4 series of communication equipment, and was on about 118 to 120 megahertz, which was an unheard of high frequency at that time. And it was a semi-secret development. It was made available because the military was planning that this is what had to be used for the invasion of France, and it was. And as a matter of just interest and curiosity, I talked to the chap who handled it, and his name was Jerry Stover. And a lot of you people in this room may know Jerry Stover because he's a member of VTS and a past head man at Communication Industries and Decibel Products. But during the war, he ended up as a major, and he had charge of the field use of these Amtrak units. And he was sent ahead where he tossed a coin to find out whether he stayed back on Isle of Wight or whether he went with the equipment in the landings in France. And he, as he considers it, he won. He went to France. You have to have a weird kind of sense of humor to understand that. I mean, under the circumstances. But this is what happened. And they took the equipment ashore and set it up, and they had trained themselves that they could put this stuff up in about 2 or 3 hours at the most and have it ready to go. They had this ready to go in about 20 minutes, and they were talking back to the Isle of Wight on the landing in Normandy. So it gave us no question about it in my mind. It had an awful lot to do with my little company being awarded 4 Army Navy E's, and there's no one else in the country that has 4 Army Navy E's except Bell Laboratory and about 3 or 4 more people. That was an experimental model of the Amtrak. That's not one of them.
No. This is some of the publicity we got hit with towards the end of World War II. When people like Hallicraft and so forth geared up to go into amateur and shortwave listener receivers, And the QST magazine carried these kind of advertisements. Echophone was another name for Hallicrafter back then. Now, at the end of World War II, I guess we're trying to find out the exact dates, and Fred Lincoln's been trying to pick Charlie Higginbottom's mind, but Fred may want to tell you a few things about real high-power landmobile base station transmitters.
Well, this situation just happens to be a 3,000-watt transmitter at 30 megahertz. And since we have Charlie Higginbottom here and Roger Madden, who was very active in the FCC a few years back, this is typical or the same as transmitter which we supply to major state police groups all over the country. We delivered about 125 of these altogether. In an atmosphere at the time, there was no such thing as getting a license to have a 3,000-watt transmitter at 30 megahertz. But the long story that goes behind this, and I'll tell you about it, in this respect, that this would have never happened, I do not believe, if it hadn't been for Silver Dollar Jim West, a rather important character out of Houston, Texas, that wanted a radio system because he was mad at the telephone company. So he was going to want his own radio system so he could talk no matter where he was in Texas, or he'd go up to Minnesota to the hospital up there, or he'd go out to Colorado Springs to the Broadmoor and stay out there. He'd go over to New Orleans to the racetrack. But he wanted to talk to all these places. So we just happened to pick a very good sunspot period, and I convinced this guy that I could do anything. I had miracles, and so there was no problem for me to communicate from Texas to New York City if I picked the right time. So I had this all worked out. But in any case, I had without a question of doubt the most lucrative, best, and interesting arrangement with Jim West as a supplier, because I not only supplied him the equipment for which he paid more than list price most of the time, but in addition, when my wife told Jim one time when we were visiting down in his Texas home at River Oaks Boulevard in Houston, that no wonder we couldn't buy a Cadillac because he had them all cornered. This was right after World War II. And you could place an order for a Cadillac, but you had to wait 3 years to get delivery. And he had about 8 or 9 of them in his garage. And my wife, because she just liked to ride him anyhow and kid him all the time, so she said, "Oh, no wonder we can't get a car." He doesn't take anything like that, forget about it. So about a month and a half later, I got a telephone call. He said, "When are you coming down here and get this car out of the garage? You're blocking the other cars." I said, "What car?" He said, "Your Cadillac." I said, "What Cadillac?" He said, "Mildred told me that you wanted a Cadillac. Now you got a Cadillac, so come down here and get it." This was a man who was my customer, was telling this to me.
Was that before or after Mildred saw the picture of those girls, Fred?
Well, this was before that, yes. But in the situation, in any case, how this was built up to this situation was that Jim put this car at my disposal, and I got down there to Texas. But I went down, as a matter of fact, in conjunction with an APCO conference, which was in Houston, and an old friend of mine was the head of the police communications in Houston at the time, and I was supplying the radio equipment to him. His name was Bob Franklin. And he made it very easy for me to do this work. And what happened, I'm getting off my track, so I better start over again somewhere. But in any case, I see these units, these 3,000 UFS, and frankly, I am still amazed at them. They were a hell of a piece of equipment. And any of you people that had an opportunity to work with them, I never heard anything except praise for their design and performance.
A few of them even wound up in the amateur bands.
It could have been. I don't know.
Had a pair of 4-1000s in the final for those of you from back in the era day.
Is Roger Madden in the audience?
Yeah, he's right behind you.
Well, now, Roger, you were in a position to know. These were in general use all over the country, weren't they?
I saw these in use in Illinois in early 70s, Fred. They were still in operation in the early 70s.
Well, I hope the rest of you heard that. He's talking about these units being actually still being used on the air in the early 70s. Now, that had to be since it would be about 1952 when I sold them to the state of Illinois. So you're talking about 20 years of service. And they were also over-designed. I mean, they were from a general standpoint, like the transformers at the bottom, give you an indication of the situation. There's no question about the fact that they could probably generate a 5-kilowatt carrier without any trouble.
As an expression as to how they were built.
This character over on the far left is Silver Dollar Jim, behind the glasses. That's Silver Dollar Jim West. And that gun he had in his hand is a high-power hunting gun. And this was at what I refer to as a famous West antenna shoot. He put up an antenna tower, and he asked me what kind of an antenna should go in the top of this tower. This was down at his ranch, and I told him, the two types that were available at that time, which one was a coaxial, the other was a ground plane. I said, I don't know until we make a check of it. So I finally get down to Texas, and he said, this damn thing doesn't work as good as the old antenna we had before. And I took a look at it, and I had a pretty good idea very quickly what it was. He had put two antennas on the top of the tower, and they were practically in phase, so the antenna power went up one of them and came down the other one. And blocked the whole thing off, and he didn't get performance. I said, that's your trouble. And he said, what do I do now? I said, one of those antennas has to come down. He said, how am I going to get any of my people to go 400 feet up this tower, the way this thing rickers back and forth and so forth? I said, well, one of the antennas has to come down. And he said, well, which one should come down? And I said, well, I really don't know. I mean, I don't know. I can't see anything different. But I think we'd better leave the coaxial antenna up there and let it down. He said, okay, we'll have an antenna shoot.
Yeah, but Fred, last time you told that story, you admitted to the fact that those 3,000 UFS transmitters were very touchy on standing wave ratios. And they used the shootout to trim the length of the radiating element of the ground plane.
Now, if I'm going to have this kind of help, you can tell your story yourself. I won't be involved in this kind of a raucous conversation. Well, in any case, we had the antenna shoot. He got all his people around, and most of the Texans down there were pretty good shots. So they sat around in captain chairs like Jim was sitting backwards, around in a circle under the antenna, and took turns to take a shot at the antenna. And the person who brought down the antenna was to get a $100 bill. So they went out, and then a $100 bill was a lot of money in those days. That was like $1,000 would be right now. And so this is exactly what happened. And when they finally brought this ground plane antenna down and pulled it down, it was amazing how accurate this shooting had been, how this thing was chewed up at the bottom where it was broken off, where I had said it should be broken loose, so it's set up. And that's the picture of the antenna shoot in any case.
Now we get into the era of Fred Link making television transmitters for Dumont.
Well, now you really got me. But I see 2XVT, that was the Dumont experimental, yes, that was the Dumont experimental RF portion of it, their initial transmitter, the VHF transmitter. We made all the Dumont TV 5-kilowatt transmitters that went all over the country. I mean, they're down out here to, was it CAMO-X? Is that the St. Louis station? In any case, the St. Louis station was one of them that bought one of these Dumont 5-kilowatt, the initial 5-kilowatt TV transmitters. But this is not any part of that transmitter. This is just an experimental effort of what would happen on the frequencies that were involved. High-level modulator transmitter.
Then there was a period of time when, on I guess the 8th floor of the Link Radio building, there was one production line of TV transmitters and the other production line of land mobile.
This is the 5 kilowatt. This is the 5 kilowatt basic transmitter that was the Dumont unit. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, at the end of World War II, there was a growing sense of a need for real personal communications. And there was a party with us tonight you met earlier who convinced the Federal Communications Commission to come up with a radio for a John Q. Public. And if we ever get finished with this program tonight, you'll hear from him. At the end of World War II, say 1946, when the television industry started delivering television sets to the public, they all started with channel number 1. But actually, there never was a TV transmitter on the air in this country on TV channel 1, because that was the beginning of recognizing the need for more land mobile frequencies, and the 30 to 40 megahertz band, which had been moved up to 30 to 44, went up to 30 to 50. And as part of that shuffle that took place at that time, and the reallocation of the FM entertainment band, we lost channel 1. So for a few years, people were buying television sets with a TV channel 1 capability, but never could use it. At the end of World War II, the Commission took a few other bold steps and created some more eligibility requirements, eligibility categories for licensing, and one was the taxicab radio service. The New York Herald Tribune carried a story of the first taxicab radio-equipped vehicles. And the story goes something like the little old lady in tennis shoes called for a cab, and by the time she hung up, there was a cab driver honking his horn in front of the door, and she beckoned him in to talk to her, and she said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Well, I'm your cab you called for." She said, "Oh, you drive too fast. I'm not going to go with you." And the other brought new eligibility for the use of two-way radio with the common carriers. So both the land wire, the telephone companies, and the telephone answering services provided what was then called a miscellaneous common carrier service. And at the end of this is a 1-horsepower Link Radio mobile installation going into as late as almost 1950, I think, Fred. I call the 1-horsepower installation, which means 746 watts. So it's a very powerful mobile system. Well, when was this put out of service, Fred?
Well, I mean, the thing is, Stu didn't tell you the whole story. This is a picture that was taken of an actual system in service. This was not a radio system that was just on paper. This is a radio system in service during World War II. In other words, you couldn't get fuel for cars, and besides, I couldn't have gotten a license as a driver for this driver in this car because he was a convicted felon that was released from Sing Sing to work for us during World War II, and he did very well. He was pensioned, but relieved and sent back into society. His name was Bill Duran, and I hope he's still alive and doing well.
When you went to work for Link Radio back then, I came out of the Navy in 1945 and started in October of that year, and you had to spend a couple of weeks down on the production line or the test line. And one of the jobs you had to do as a greenhorn was keep putting new batteries in this thing, because the horse obviously could pull the wagon and also keep the battery charged. And you soon learn that you had to wear a good tie clip, otherwise your tie lay on top of the battery. You had holes in it the next morning.
Can I add one thing to that? Some of these people may not understand the situation, but at this particular time, that this picture was taken, I had, which I still do, but I had at that time some very well-renowned American saddlebred show horses. As my daughter, my older daughter Joanne, was showing, and we had one horse that was just happened to have a name, Link's Noble Prince. And Noble Prince was the name, but we were criticized for using the name Noble Prince because it already had been issued to someone else years before. So we got around that by calling the horse Link's Noble Prince, which was fine. But Joanne was winning everything week after week at every show, And this horse ultimately became 4 times national champion. That's Lynx Noble Prince. And so what happened, this boy, this Bill Duran, who drove this idea, had about 4 members of his direct family, meaning sisters and brothers, working for me, and about 7 cousins, I think, because they kept bringing these people from the Lower East Side to get jobs, and you can't refuse them because they all had very good connections with the mafia. So that, but in any case, he was into this situation, and this family, he rented this horse. He made the deal with me whether he could go. He said, look, he said, I'll make a good deal. And I believe the rental was either $1 or $2 a day for the horse and wagon. And he took care of it. But not this particular horse, but a horse that preceded this was such a swayback horse that I couldn't stand the strain of seeing it out on the street. I felt sorry for it. And I asked Bill to get a different horse and not because of this situation, but the horse that he had before, which was so swayback, was a dark chestnut, which was like Noble Prince. Noble Prince was not a white horse. Noble Prince was a dark chestnut. That he had, he felt sorry for it, and its family, these girls that worked for me, made a blanket for the horse. Well, that was wonderful to make a blanket for the horse because you felt sorry for the horse. But they went all the way. They put a sign on it and sewed in the sign, Lynx Noble Prince. So you can imagine being in showing horses and having your horses win major events one week after another. Lynx Noble Prince win championship or something like that, and you go down the street and see a horse go by with a sign on it, hanging on the side, Lynx Noble Prince. And so it got to be one of the funny things in New York City. Go ahead, you got it.
You saw the pictures of the 2-piece mobile installations, and as we approached the 50s, we went back lower in power again, 1-piece units with the receiver and transmitter in one box. And this was one of the forerunners of the business radio, which yet hadn't been authorized, but saw a lot of service in taxi cabs, and also in some police use too, especially where budgets were tight. And in the mid-50s, the Federal Communications Commission took another bold step and authorized the business radio service. And this gives you some idea in the early days of business radio, starting in 57, at the annual growth, and today it's, for many years now, it's been the largest single licensing activity at the FCC. And a fellow in Raleigh, North Carolina, Charlie Browning, was making small Unicom AM radios for airport use, and he did a quick conversion job to high band 150 megahertz, and he had this little unit, about 10 watts, and it had a very novel feature. It had a very universal power supply. This is about the time the automobile industry was changing over the 12 volts in passenger cars, and depending upon which cable harness you plugged in the back, you worked on 6 volts negative ground, 6 volts positive ground, 12 volts negative ground, 12 volts positive ground, or 117 volt AC. And with the simplex business radio assignments back then, the idea was for a suede shoed salesman to walk in with one of these in each hand, and then he would put a whip antenna on this on the secretary's desk, invite the manager or the owner out to the car, put a gutter mount on, take him around the block and say, see how good it sounds? And just imagine how much better it's going to be when you put the 100-foot tower in your backyard. And it was a very successful, so successful that General Electric, in their house magazine, wrote up the company called Aerotron in Raleigh, North Carolina, and GE came out with this competitive model, which they called the Pacer. And then shortly after that, Motorola took one of their motorcycle radios and repackaged it and called it a business dispatcher, which some people call the Pacer Chaser. Of course, the early days of portable radios, which use vacuum tubes, especially the peanut-type tubes, this, by today's standards, of course, a pretty large radio. And Fred Link was also involved in the motorcycle radio business. And in one version of the motorcycle radio, the receiver was mounted in a wooden cabinet for a monitor receiver. There were, monitor receivers began to become popular in the 50s for a variety of reasons, both legal and illegal. Taxi cabs would monitor their competitors and steal the calls and that sort of thing. A few people you might remember in here some of you, of course, you can probably spot Fred Link. And this goes back to the days of Jim Barr, who was then the bureau chief of the Safety and Special Radio Services Bureau at the FCC. Charlie Higginbottom's predecessor, the white-haired fellow, and is one of our former board members and now our financial advisor of the VTS. And the upper left-hand side is Art Goldsmith. When this picture was taken, I guess he was with the Department of Transportation. And the lower right-hand corner, believe it or not, is Jay Kitchen, who is now president of NABER. We became very much involved in 450 megahertz equipment, and that was not too long after a very notable person within land mobile circles said that 450 megahertz would never work for land mobile, traditional land mobile use. And this is a link radio first generation version of 450 megahertz using then Amperex tubes made in Holland under the experimental number AX9903 and then later called the 5894. And we loaned some of these to the Detroit Checker Cab and Yellow Checker Cab. And I'll get back to that. When the commission came out with 450 megahertz, they did wisely separate the base and mobile frequencies by 5 megahertz, which made mobile relays very, very practical. And the mobile relay concept also had the advantage that you could take what I call an AC mobile station for a control station that would talk through the mobile relay, and you didn't have to run telephone lines anymore. And even back then in the 50s, the telephone companies were beginning to find ways of charging extra tariffs, because when they found you had both audio and control voltage, you didn't pay for one line, you paid for 2 lines. The rates were determined by the functions and not by the number of wires. Detroit Checker Cab liked the idea of going up to 450 so well. One reason was that the gypsy cabs were buying these monitor radios that were made in Indianapolis for about $29.95, and they'd be around town listening to the base station, stealing the calls. But Detroit Checker Cab had 900 units on the street, and we had a fellow at Link Radio who was the specialist in filing applications at the FCC. His name was Jim Craig. And he filed a license for them, and they would only grant 3 frequencies. Well, that meant 3 dispatchers talking simultaneously would be the maximum capability. And there's no way on a rainy payday night in Detroit, you could dispatch 900 cabs with 3 dispatchers. And not knowing any better, and by this time we really needed the business, Fred had sunk a lot of money into the development of 450, and we needed some good-sized orders, and an order for 900 units was not to be sneezed at back then. So not knowing any better, we come up with a zone system. We weren't smart enough to call it cells, but we divided the city up into 8 zones in such a way that you never use the same frequency twice, and there was a switch on the control head, and we made up plastic maps of the city with what channel you had to switch to when you were going through that part of the city. And these plastic maps were then attached to the sun visor, and it took a driver about 2 weeks to memorize the whole city, and that was our manual handoff. Very simple, basic cellular system. And the first ones went on the air experimentally in 1949, and I think the installation was completed by about 1952, the early part of 52. And of course, today you see the popular site alongside the roads. Of course, paging came along. The first paging was really the first police radio. The first police radios were a one-way system, a modified broadcast receiver in a car, and the base station operating just above the broadcast band would transmit out, and the police car would have to stop somewhere and find a telephone and call the dispatcher back and verify I got the message. Of course, paging has come a long way since then. And, we had the battle for spectrum back right after World War II for land mobile. We're still involved, and you've heard all the stories about how scarce spectrum is. There have been a number of, changes in policy. We are involved in UHF TV sharing, and of course we've got up to 800 megahertz now, but you know all of that. And, of course, we're reaching that age now we're doing other things than just voice transmission. This is a navigation system that can be on a vehicle, and you can either multiplex or sequentially feed signals into a 800 megahertz system in particular, and not only does the driver know where he is, but the dispatcher knows. So regardless of what the driver says, the dispatcher actually does know where a vehicle is. but there have been some union problems with that too. But this is a simple dead reckoning system which maps the city, has the city mapped on a tape, and as a vehicle moves around, the map keeps changing every few seconds, and the bright spot tells the driver exactly where he is. This has gone off on another tangent now. ETAC, who started out going very heavy in the ambulance field and public safety, have been sold to a publishing company, and now they're merchandising this to use with the rental vehicles so that they can program other information where the nearest restaurants are, hotels, and so forth. And we're back to this, Fred, for Pleasant Dreams. I don't know what it has to do with radio, but anyway.
They haven't moved.
Haven't moved. You noticed that. Anyway, you've heard of years ago of his master's voice, and in recent years that's changed now with the where GE was a spin-off of RCA years ago, and now RCA is becoming a spin-off of GE. So thank you.
I'd like to just add one thing that I meant to mention before, that there's absolutely no relationship to the fact that a radio link was named Radio Link because of me, but I was accused of it, and the military. And then when you multiplied the problem by calling it an FM radio link, they knew that my name was never FM, Fred M. Link. It is something else. So it's not true, but the military picked it up, and they, instead of cutting it back and taking the onus off of it, they use it all the time. They said, well, of course we changed it. This is his name. His name was changed to suit the situation. So everyone thought I got the business because my name was that way. But that wasn't quite so.
Oh, Fred and Stu, thank you very much.
We're going to have Al.
Okay. What we're going to do here is take a 5-minute break to either fill up or empty, as the case may be. For those of you not in the conference, follow somebody who is from the conference. They know where the little boy and little girl's room is. Then we're going to start out with Al Gross when we get back and take a look at the first handheld two-way radio. Take a look at the first UHF CBN radio, and take a look at the device that was the idea behind Dick Tracy's wrist radio. So please be very quick, 5 minutes or so, and then come on back, please. Also, for the rest of the folks, for the hams that are here, we have a IEEE membership booth here. And contrary to popular belief, a degree is not required to be an associate member of the IEEE. Stop over and talk to the membership booth. Put in front of that PA.
I got a microphone
Yeah, but I
here.
get about as far as this.
No, I won't need that as long as this is alive.
Okay.
So he'd be able to talk about he later.
A lot of people were wondering what I was doing up here. But, you see, I have a shortwave receiver. Everybody know what a shortwave receiver is? One you can hold in your fist. How many of you have seen one that you can hold in your fist? You did. That's cheating, you know that, Stu. Mr. Linkhauer, eh?
Oh, well, now, Al, don't...
Fred, you haven't seen this. This is not a link radio. This is one you hold in your fist. Hey, where is the DeForest Ultra Audion that wasn't on that rack? The tryout he made with the tit on top. Where was that? You remember? I had 2 of those. I tried to get the damn thing to oscillate at 300 megahertz, and I got as far as the broadcast band. Well, you know. Well, let's...
Expecting too much.
We may have to put you on a hand mic. We're not picking you up very good with that loud.
We're not doing too well? Okay, well, modern technology.
One hand hold the mic with the other.
I invented a wireless microphone. These guys want to wire me up. You unwire me. Before I get a second to get back to the thing that got hot, too. I don't have it turned on yet. Give me 1 second here. No, I'll have to get back to my board. This off of you?
I feel very strongly he has to be made a fellow.
Lift your right foot.
Because it gives the youth program an indication of viability.
Lee Snavelle, Cleveland, Ohio. Remember?
I remember.
I got one of those darn things. It's a huge monster. You know, my little Ford would, you know, I turned with that Lee Snavelle thing hooked up on my Ford. I pushed the button and the engine not only stopped, the car stops. Anyway, I'm not going to make this too long because everybody's getting a little tired, but we'll start off a little bit about how did you get personal radio? Everybody saw the picture that Stu had up there. And how many had seen this up here at the table? Well, good. I was my middle year in college when I learned how to bend sheet metal. So I started to bend sheet metal, and I thought I'd try to put some radio parts in it. And I managed to get a pretty good package in here. And I built 3 of these at 300 megahertz. And 300 megahertz, at that time, 100 megahertz was the end of the spectrum range when I was playing around with radio. As Fred and Stu had mentioned before, things around 180 megahertz and you were out of the world. And how did I measure frequency? With lecture wires. I didn't have digital machinery, so I had to take a meter stick and measure the wavelength with a lecture wire system, and believe it or not, I got to 300 megahertz. At least the lights went out every place I measured at 300 megahertz. So here it is. For those that hadn't seen it, I made 3, and we got on top of the terminal tower in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a tall building about 750 feet high. And another friend of mine in Akron, Ohio, we called each other on the telephone, and we made a DX contact between Cleveland and Akron, Ohio, 45 miles. But it was a clear shot, and we made sure that we had nothing in the way, and there was nothing in the way because with the good high-power binoculars, you could see the other tower. So anyway, it was a DX record. And I got a little publicity in a famous magazine called QST, and about establishing a DX record at 300 megahertz. I paid no attention to the fact that I made a DX record. However, at about the start of the war in 1941 time frame, 1942, I got a call from a friend of mine in Washington, D.C., who remembered this radio. And he was associated with an organization called the Office of Strategic Services. How many here have heard of that particular thing? A few. Today it's called CIA. There was a man in charge of this agency, General Donovan, and unlike Fred's connection in the military, I didn't have too many, but I got to meet a general in the Army who was in charge of the Office of Strategic Service, and he had a problem. His problem was supplying the President, Franklin Roosevelt, with fresh intelligence, counterintelligence, and intelligence from occupied countries in Europe and Africa, because Churchill was getting instant intelligence immediately the same day. Roosevelt was getting his intelligence maybe many days later, which wasn't good enough for him. He wanted clear intelligence quickly. And the program that was to be my particular part of the program was developing a system of plane-to-ground communication, the only safe way of getting counterintelligence from occupied countries out quickly. And the principle of the program was there would be a plane equipped with receiving and transmitting equipment at some frequency to be chosen that would be safe from direction finding by the occupying enemy forces and the aircraft. The principle was that it had to be English. not coded or encoded. Because one of the problems with coding and encoding at that time was the scrambling of the information, because it was largely, coding and decoding was a very laborious process, by the way. And the Germans were always changing codes, and we were always changing codes. So we came up with the idea, a group of ham guys like ourselves, of being able to talk from plane to ground at some frequency that was way up above 100 megahertz that could not be detected by the Germans. We chose 250 megahertz because at the time, when I went over to Europe, and we had some general radio equipment at the time, we discovered that the Germans were unable to go above 183 megahertz. By the way, they did have a radar that did operate around 183 megahertz, as I recall. And that's as far as they went, but they had no receiving equipment or no direction finding equipment that would go beyond that. So we chose 250 megahertz, which is just above channel 13, as a unique spot to put a piece of communication equipment. But before we did this operated at 300. We tried several trips by plane outside of the city of Richmond, Virginia, where the OSS had a training installation for radio operators. And this worked very successfully, even though it was AM, and even though we did have some problems with engine ignition in the aircraft. But we still were able to get intelligent communication from a plane flying at around 5,000 feet for a distance of about 20 miles. And that was exceptional at that time. In studying the program, we decided that the best way to do it was not with a vertical antenna, but with an antenna that would enhance the signal towards the aircraft. And we decided to go horizontal. This is 250 megahertz horizontal dipole. The principle behind this is that at my height, assuming the operator was between 5.5 and 6 feet tall, that the reflection from the ground would have a tendency to elevate the shape of the donut, forcing the donut a lot higher because of the ground reflections. Is everyone familiar with what I'm saying here? So I don't get too far ahead. Fred and Stu, I know, knows. Also, we had some directivity. We could turn in the direction of the flying aircraft, and in the plane, we had a dipole that would fit out of the camera well in the particular aircraft we used, and we could also use that for direction finding to some degree. And it worked very well. This enhanced the signal. And uniquely, it was made portable. I never tried this with one hand. I'm surprised I can do it, but anyway, it's silver-plated aluminum. Those that remember silver-plating aluminum was a little trick on its own. So I spent from 1942 to 1944 designing and building this little transceiver. The equipment in the aircraft looked pretty much like a large piece of Fred's gear, which operated with vacuum tubes, by the way, and it had a wire recorder attached to it. At that time, we didn't have tape, we had wire. And incidentally, Bill Lear did have a radio, I think he developed for either himself or for Motorola, that had a wire recorder in it for commercial consumption. Well, anyway, 250 megahertz, for those that hadn't seen the inside of one. Okay, this is a nice little set. And if you look at this very closely, you'll see the audio section is surface mount technology, 1944. And if there's any question about whether that surface mount technology is in here, come on up and take a close look after this is all over. This is surface mount technology. Now, during this period of time that I was doing this work, we produced 500 of these radios, and they were successfully used in the European and the Far Eastern operations successfully. The story has been written by others. I was not involved in writing the story. And the Walker Company published a 2-volume set of the Secret War Report of the OSS, which may or may not be available, and a story about the Joan Eleanor operation, which this was code-named, has all been told. And in a uniquely July of 1945, General Donovan wrote a report which was classified secret, and I have copies of it here for those that want to see it, in which he described the successful use of this for intelligence gathering in this clandestine operation. And how many have seen the Motorola handheld walkie-talkie? You're familiar with that? This was classified until July of 1976. Well, on the other hand, there was a man in the Radio Intelligence Division of the FCC by the name of George Sterling. And if anyone wants to know about George Sterling, Fred knows, Stu, Charlie, maybe there might be one or two others, but yeah, and just recently, George passed away at the age of, I think, about 80, 90. W1AE, is that correct, Stu? Yeah. Yeah, right. George was head of the Radio Intelligence Division for the Federal Communications Commission, and his job was manifestly to determine how any intelligence, any transmissions in the United States may be counter to our internal safety. That was his job. George and I met, and I introduced him to members of the OSS, and he saw this radio. And we played with it, and I demonstrated this. George insisted on showing this to members of the FCC back in early 1945, and I got permission to do that. And the people in the commission who really got onto this was Commissioner E.K. Jack Jett and Rosal Hyde and Charles Denny, some names that our friends here all remember. Yeah. And they fell in love with the idea. They unanimously agreed that this would be unique for personal communication for any citizen of the United States 18 years of age or older. In July 28, 1945, Jack Jett wrote an article, Phone Me by Air, which appeared in Saturday Evening Post, describing citizens radio, meaning personal two-way radio for the public. That's how the connotation CB got started. But the original band, 460, 470 megahertz, still has allocations in it, and it's still called Class A CB. Am I right, Charlie? Wrong. But my license says Class A Citizens Radio. I just got it recently. What do you know, Stu, do I have to pull out all the rabbits? You know, I still got it. Well, anyway, General Mobile Radio is correct, but it's still Class A CB. Well, Roger knows, so, you know. Well, you're right, Roger, and in the meantime, I'll send you a copy of my Class A CB license. How's that? But I agree. Well, I've got the license, and whatever it says, I agree with you. I see. Yeah.
Someone knows the right answer, but it'll give you a bad time.
Well, I love it. I've had my ups and downs in this business, and I have a lot of friends, and all you people are my friends.
How
do you know? I've been bootlegging for 62 years, so why stop? I even got a call one day in Cleveland, Ohio. I have to make this remark. John Russ, there was a radio inspector in Cleveland, Ohio. He lived not too far from me. He says, "You know, Al, you're coming in on my wife's kitchen radio." I says, "You know, you live 5 miles from me." He came over and he took a look at my handsome rig with a pair of Gamatron HK454Hs, which are something like those two tubes that you saw in the big rig that Fred used to make. And he looked at my transformer, which was a big monster UTC thing, and he says, Al, are you running a kilowatt? So I says, yeah. So I cranked up the big, huge Variac to where it read 1 kilowatt. He says, what would happen if I turned the knob a little further? I says, well, I don't usually do that. But, well, anyway, we got along fine together. So, but getting back to the story now, Sterling showed this equipment to the commissioners, and in particular, Chet, Roswell Hyde, and Charles Denny thought the idea of personal communication after the war would be a great idea to give the public an opportunity to get its hand into some of the spectrum allocations that all the industry would want to gobble up. That was the theory about the idea of having public two-way radio eventually. That's the inside story behind the story. When Roswell Hyde wrote this article, he envisioned what we have today. It was his vision of what today is personal radio. So that's already been documented, and that's the story. I was uniquely in a position with the right equipment at the right time to help foster the idea within the commission. So I truly am a guy who was instrumental in getting the product to the commission, but I didn't invent citizen radio, even though I continued my career in it. It was the commission who helped me in many ways in fostering this activity, because when the war was over in 1945, I went back to Cleveland and I started a company called Citizens Radio Corporation. And I went to work substantially on a CB set, or a personal radio set for 460, 470 megahertz. It was divided into 3 segments, 460 to 462, 465, the center section, and 467 to 467 to 470. That's the way it was divided up. Class A on 2 sides, and the walkie-talkie in Class B in the center section. And I went to work on that handheld unit. As you notice, there's a similarity. You notice the similarity? This is 250, this is 460. And I thought I had it made. This worked real good. Boy, this put out a lot of poop. Surface mount technology, still here, but I'm using different tubes. I'm using at that time, what was called a T3 Sylvania tube that was developed during the proximity fuse period. These tubes were their designs. And they perform beautifully at 460, 470 megahertz, as you see up here. My problem was that when the committee got together and decided to set frequency stability recommendations for this kind of equipment, me and my big mouth, I stuck my foot in and I put a real tight spec on it. And I says, we ought to be able to hold this. Nobody really was sure whether we could or not. So I submitted a bunch of these units to the FCC lab, and they failed the frequency stability problem, the requirements. Now we get into the fun part. At this point, I had invested a lot of my personal cash into getting this far. In the meantime, I was making some amateur radio 2.5 meter transceivers, which Stu may remember, called the Gross Ultraphone. It had a transmitter and receiver in it, and I sold it with an antenna. I was selling Harrison radio, by the way. I had some good customers, and in Chicago, some of those boys, and around the country. So I was making some money to support my further activity, but in the meantime, I developed a friend, W9AA, at that time was Cy Reed, at Montgomery Ward, who heard about my work in Cleveland, Ohio, and I went to Montgomery Ward, and they were very jealous between Montgomery Ward and Sears about who you sell your product to. And Cy liked this idea when I demonstrated this model to him. He said, Al, if you can get type approval, we would like to buy these immediately. And I saw a golden opportunity, and I made a deal with Cy Reed. If I get an opportunity, they wanted this exclusive. I said, you can have it exclusive on one condition. Over a 6-month period of time, I have to have a non-cancelable order for 25,000 of these, and they agreed. I went to Washington with the Montgomery Ward people, and they discussed what their marketing plan was going to be for an approved transceiver. I came up with a model that looked like this, but was not circuit-wise capable of doing the job. So I went to a company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin called Centralab. How many have heard of the name Centralab? Who were involved in making printed circuits on ceramic. And there they are. The reason for that is that I took all this copper circuitry that was in the RF system and I put it on ceramic that was extremely hard. It has the same characteristic as fused quartz. This way the circuit would not expand or contract over temperature. Is everyone with me with what I'm talking about here? I don't want to lose you now. Because during that work in 1947, I met a guy by the name of Jack Kilby. Does that name ring a bell to anybody here? Well, it will in a minute. Jack was working at Centralab in the chemistry lab and in the ceramics lab while he was working his way through the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Jack Kilby and I sat down and I said to Jack, we should put the input and output circuit on ceramic, and this way we have all our components mounted to a substrate that won't drift. Now, I use the word substrate. Why? Because it gave him some ideas which he'd used later on in 1958 in his development of the invention of the integrated circuit. Now, do anyone know who I'm talking about now? Jack Kilby, who went to Texas Instrument in 1958. He's Mr. Integrated Circuit. Well, Jack and I, we're still good friends today, Jack liked the idea. He used a glass plate, and he mounted the semiconductor, the glass plate, and made the interconnections the same way as they're made on here. I want to show you how technology is diverted. This is the guy that did it. This passed the FCC's requirements for frequency stability, and on March 22nd, 1948, at the IRE convention in New York City, the chairman of the FCC, Wayne Coy, announced to the world, you now have personal two-way radio for any citizen of the United States 18 years of age or older. Stu and Fred will remember these. Roger, I don't know how old you were at that time. Me and my requirements. Well, anyway, and I'm 30 years old, and sitting across the table at the Commodore Hotel in New York City is Cy Reed of Montgomery Ward, reaches in his pocket and hands me that non-cancelable order for $2 million worth of walkie-talkies. 1948 bucks is not bad for a 30-year-old engineer. And a month later, the U.S. Coast Guard came along. I got to tell you this story. This is a beaut. The U.S. Coast Guard has a beautiful lab in Washington, and they said, you know, Al, we got a screen room. We'll take it in the screen room and test it. I said, your screen room, and I looked at it. It was triple screening of something. I says, you know, your screen room isn't good enough. Everything gets shut out. They took the unit into the screen room, and I was on the outside. They closed the door, and we talked back and forth. That wasn't all. They says, we're going to take this aboard a submarine and see how it works inside to outside. I says, as long as you got rubber gaskets around the submarine, it's going to work back into it. Well, that test was also run by the Coast Guard, and believe it or not, from the torpedo room to a sealed room to the external part of the submarine, after it was closed, at 450 megahertz, we still got signal into the torpedo room. That's pretty good. For those that understand electromagnetic radiation. Right, Ted? So don't talk about screen rooms to me, because I had some experience with a few. And consequently, the Coast Guard gave me an order for another $600,000, 1948 bucks worth of these for ship-to-shore use. And I have pictures of all that. So I went ahead with my work for this part of the program. In the meantime, during the course of my activity with the FCC and just towards the prior end of the war, a committee had been formed to promulgate the rules and regulations for, at that time, I think it was Part 19. Is that the way I gather it, Roger? Charlie? Part 19? Well, it's immaterial. Well, yeah, it's right, Part 19. And Dan Noble, who, God rest his soul, who's been a personal friend of mine for years, Mr. Motorola, really, said, Al, I want you to come to Chicago and show your work to my boss, Mr. Paul Galvin. And at that time, I had just completed some activity on a radio paging device, which I was asked to develop for hospital use. Radio paging devices here. This is the first one. I was doing this simultaneous at the same time I was doing my work with the original CB set. This is the first radio pager, and I made a unit that would use two-tone filtering for the page. I think they still use that technique today, although I haven't kept up with it. I had both ideas in actual prototypes when I went to Chicago to meet Paul Galvin. He liked what he saw here. He liked what he saw here. And at that time, I also met his adjutant, who later became really the key member of Motorola, by the name of Bill Weiss, who today is a very close personal friend of mine. He got me involved with the Iridium project, and we'll talk about that later. And Paul Galvin insisted on being licensed for this transceiver and for this radio pager. And for those that don't know what a patent looks like, this is what a patent looks like. Right, Fred? And I have other patents, too. I have antenna patents, a few other little goody circuit patents, whatever. And, you know, you spend a lifetime in this, you acquire something beside a reputation. And I'm not so sure mine will bear all the good tidings that Fred had and the luck that Stu had. But I made a buck or two, which I gave to my kids and their kids. So you see the two developments here at that time became the property of Galvin Manufacturing Company, and at the same time, and I have to tell this because this is part of the story, RCA filed suit on me on infringing patents dealing with communication devices. 2 years after the suit was filed, somewhere between 1955 and 1957, the U.S. Patent Court handed down a priority of invention to me. So I am the prior inventor for whatever RCA claims made, and we turned around and filed suit against RCA, and we won that case. So RCA didn't bother me after that, but AT&T did, because I gave a demonstration of cordless telephones over telephone lines in the FCC offices from Washington to Cleveland, Ohio, with 1 day's permission by the AT&T and the Bell people to allow me to do that over their lines. But of course, you all know that the Carter phone decision in 1972 cut that cord. So I had to wait all that time before I could talk about cordless telephones. So that is the genesis of personal radio, the beeper, and cordless telephones. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to query me on? The history is well known, it has been well written, and well documented. In the meantime, a little anecdote story. After I got type approval, I got a lot of publicity, and I was real thrilled for a 30-year-old engineer to get all this publicity. And I got a call in Cleveland, Ohio, right after the announcement in New York from a fellow by the name of Chester Gould. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Chester Gould is the artist that did Dick Tracy. He's dead now. He wanted to see this walkie-talkie in person. So he flew to Cleveland, Ohio, and I gave him a demonstration of the walkie-talkie, but he saw on my desk a thing that looked like this. and it had a strap on it. This strap here fits on the wrist. So I can't put this mic down. I'd be happy to use this. This is a wireless microphone, by the way. See, and I went like this, and I talked into it over an FM radio. Sounds real good. This is actually the genesis of wireless microphones. It works like it still works today. It's an FM transmitter, 2 tubes. He saw this, and I paid no attention to his interest other than I had shown him the walkie-talkie. That year, about the middle of the year, he called me on the phone. He said, Mr. Gross, do you have any objection if he uses this idea on his cartoon character? And I said, no, not at all. October of that year, 1948, appeared the first strip with the Dick Tracy wrist radio, and Chester Gould sent me the original strips, 2 strips, for that day and the day later. That is the genesis of the wrist radio. It hasn't died. Here's another wrist radio. This is the latest Motorola paging wrist radio. It has a Timex watch and the Motorola chips in there for paging, and it has a fairly good range from, say, an elevated antenna site of about 40, 50 miles. And it has your telephone number, who calls you, all on here, for those that want to see it. Of course, here's the other types of pagers, and of course everybody has seen the other types of pagers. So now you got the story of the Dick Tracy wrist radio. And for the benefit of Jay over there, I could have used your 5 kilowatt rig in here, you know, but how would I carry it on my wrist? You know, it would take a truck. See, so you see, Fred went his way, I went my way, Stu went his way. I used to buy parts from Stu when he was with Hammerlin. I loved the guy because he gave me things I wanted. Yeah, but you gave me a lot of good advice too, Stu. Don't deny that. And consequently, my life with these gentlemen has been in and out, and with Charlie Higginbottom over here, I've enjoyed that relationship real well. Now I want to show you something. I kept talking about, oops, I think I lost it. I talked about a shortwave radio set, and I said it would be in my fist. Don't talk. That's a shortwave receiver. That's pretty small, isn't it? I did that in 1948. I built 4 of them for Harry Diamond Laboratories, which is U.S. Army Research and Military Command. You want to see miniaturization, you're going to see it and hear it. I got a little amplifier here. It sounds like it's amplifying. There's no tricks. This is for real. This is an antenna. Here. was getting 15 megacycles, not megahertz. I keep thinking of all those rent-a-cars out there. But you did hear it. I'm sure you'll agree it does work. This is a split stator tuning capacitor right here. Very unique design. It's a screw. And that screw is so shaped, and there are coils on each side of that shape, so that you're varying the inductance on each of the two coils, both for the oscillator and the mixer. So there's no RF stage, so obviously whatever we were getting with a 4-transistor radio, and that's it. 1958. And let me tell you, I worked hard and long winding those coils under a microscope with a very fine sewing needle and extremely fine copper wire. You saw that. Fred? I wanted Fred to see. Fred hadn't seen this before, so I wanted him to see it. Because it's not a link radio, by the way. Even though I'd like to blame him for it. I could have put a discriminator in it. We could have made it FM, but I was in a hurry to build these things at 3,000 a crack. And you know, micro-miniaturization at that time was a big buzzword. You know, how do you make things, how do you get so many parts per cubic inch and all those things in there? I think, Charlie, you hadn't seen that, had you? Well, you haven't seen it. Well, you know, I was doing this work as part of a project for U.S. Army to show the possibilities of micro-miniaturization, proximity fuse activity. So you have to admit that that's a mighty small short-wave set by 1958 standards. Today, you know, there's a single chip that would do the same thing. But, you know, we're talking a few decades ago. So that ends my talk. Unless you have questions or you want to talk about anything about my work, I'll be delighted to do it. I know you're interested in things too, although you heard it. So, to let you know, nothing up my sleeve except this.
Higginbottom up here for a few minutes, and then Fred has a radio club announcement, okay? And then we'll set this back down on the table. You folks can come take a look at it, and because I want to get some pictures of it myself here. So hang on a second. Charlie, you want to come up for a second? Okay. Thank you, Al. We really enjoyed that. Okay. Well, okay. Just reminisce a second or two. Come on.
You're a VIP.
It's Charlie Higginbottom.
Uncle Charlie.
Okay.
Well, you know, when Al was talking about wireless microphones back in early or late 50s, we had a couple of manufacturers that were producing wireless microphones for sale around the country. One of them, I think, was produced by a firm named Stevens. He made loudspeakers. And there was a provision in the rules that's still there, of course, requiring type acceptance of equipment. And Stevens felt that his equipment didn't have to be type accepted, so he sold quite a few wireless microphones around the country. And our field inspectors would pick those up when they found it. Well, some of you may remember then a young actress named Dorothy Lamour. She was appearing in Las Vegas, and the word got to us that she was using a Stevens wireless microphone. And there was a big clamor amongst our field inspectors. They all wanted to go inspect Dorothy Lamour. And one thing, if you've never seen one of those wireless microphones, they wear it on their person. And, of course, to find that wireless microphone, you'd have to look inside her skin-tight dress. And life in the FCC did have its moments. We had one field inspector who was always coming up with some bright idea. There was a period when we had a few people around the Washington area that would walk around with boxes, homemade boxes, over their head, which they claimed were to shield them from harmful radio waves which were injuring their mentality. And one of them walked into our inspector's office, complained about the local radio stations, and wanted him to do something about it. He says, well, I can take care of that for you and won't have to do anything to the radio stations. He said, if you'll let me have that cane of yours, I can build a trap in there that'll trap the radio waves, and you'll never be bothered again. So he took the man's cane, wound a few turns of copper wire on the cane, Scotch taped it in place, handed it back to the man, and the fellow says, I don't hear it anymore. Took off the box he was wearing over his head, left it on the inspector's desk, and walked out, and we never saw anything or heard from him again about it. So, strange things do happen. And you meet a lot of nice people when you're in that kind of a business. That's where I met Fred and Stu and Al. And as a matter of fact, Al came into the commission one time. I'm sure he remembers this. He was concerned because someone in the commission had decided that because the citizens radio band at 460 megahertz wasn't progressing very well, that we needed a new CB band down in the region of 25, 27 megahertz. And Al rightfully believed that if that went into effect, there just wouldn't be any development of the 460 megahertz band. So Al called Commissioner Sterling, George Sterling, who was by then a commissioner, came into his office, and George called me, and I think that's where we met, Al, because that was one of my first assignments in Land Mobile. I was given the administration of the Citizens Radio Service, Part 19. And we met in George Sterling's office. These are things that you don't do anymore in the FCC. The commissioners, because of the separation of function law, are separated from the FCC staff now. They have their own advisors, legal and engineering, and they don't call on the staff for anything. And anyway, we sat down in the office, and Al told Commissioner Sterling his problem, and George looked at me and he says, well, I don't think we ought to have a 27 megahertz citizens band at this time. And it was several years after that before we did get one. But I don't want to keep boring you with these dry old tales of the FCC. I think that's we ought to wrap it up there. Thank you anyway.
Charlie, thank you very much. We appreciate it and enjoy it. Fred, you said you had a radio club announcement you wanted to make here before we close up. There's some of the stuff been put away. Yes, go ahead, Al. Let me get Fred here, and then I'll give it back to you.
Can't resist the opportunity to tell you something about the radio club. Quite a few people in the audience are already members of the radio club, and quite a few of those that are here are already fellows and members of the radio club. And I want you people who might have an idea that you'd like to be a part of the Radio Club of America, you are eligible by invitation only, but there isn't a person in this room, as far as I'm concerned, that isn't eligible. So if you would like to consider becoming a part of the Radio Club activity, and I'm very proud to say that all the key people that have been introduced tonight are all members of the Radio Club. This is a Radio Club function as far as I'm concerned, and we'd like to have you consider participating in this industry arrangement. So if the idea of being part of the Radio Club of America appeals to you, it is not an expensive effort, and you'll be associated with a lot of very, very competent people. My friend Al, of course, my friend Jay, my friend Charlie, right out here, my friend Roger, and here, George, right there, and Ted over there, and let's see who else. Oh, a whole bunch of these people are all Radio Club members. So if you have an idea you'd like to become a part of the activity, we have applications for a few of you. I mean, meaning that's all the applications I have with me, but until they would run out, anyone who is interested, just see me or get to me. Is that what you want? And thank you an awful lot for putting up with us.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, one bit on to predicate Charlie Higginbottom, who is really a real personal friend of mine, even though I had many friends in the commission, but today the commission doesn't work like it did then. And Charlie is telling you the story between politics and regulatory. It is split, just like that. However, when 27 megahertz was called out, I was totally against what is connotated as Class D CB because I knew there would be skip. And that was why if we shortly after that, I don't mind telling you, I received my membership application from the ARL back as being the instigator of 27 megahertz. So I want to tell you the story behind the story because I never rejoined ARL after that. But the manufacturers were up in arms to get low-cost equipment out to the public. And there was a lot of pressure on by those manufacturers. They're the ones that mandated the opening of 27 megahertz Class D. I had nothing to do with it. I was totally against it. Charlie knows it. George Sterling knew it. Members of the commission knew it. But I'm only one man against a whole mob of manufacturers that want to put out today what is called in Europe the chicken band. CB is now all over the world. A few people don't know this because I've been honored in Europe and in the Orient for... Nothing funny about that. I'll show you my itinerary. They paid for my trip over there. But the greatest honor I had was when the Italians, March 22nd, 1980, arranged to have me visit Pope John Paul in Rome, who wanted to see the original radios, which I had with me at that time, and I have photographs of that interlude, and shortly after that, Radio Club of America was kind enough to... That year, Radio Club of America made me a fellow. But it had nothing to do with my visit to the Pope, but that was a great honor because I learned that at the age of 24 in Poland, he had taken an interest in amateur radio. So he had a background and knew full well what it was, and I had the opportunity of being his guest. Thank you.
Al, thank you very much. What we're going to do is set the table back down. See if folks take a look at the rest of the stuff. I want to get some pictures myself. I hope you enjoyed this evening. Good night.
I got it.
There what he is there.
Yeah. How did you give me a ring.
I have them. Yeah, that's like the magazine back then.
The story that I'm not opportunity to tell you something about the radio club. Quite a few people in the audience are already members of the radio club, and quite a few of those that are here are already fellows and members of the radio club. And I want you people who might have an idea that you'd like to be a part of the Radio Club of America, you are eligible by invitation only, but there isn't a person in this room, as far as I'm concerned, that isn't eligible. So if you would like to consider becoming a part of the Radio Club activity, and I'm very proud to say that all the key people that have been introduced tonight are all members of the Radio Club. This is a Radio Club function as far as I'm concerned, and we'd like to have you consider participating in this industry arrangement. So if the idea of being part of the Radio Club of America appeals to you, it is not an expensive effort, and you'll be associated with a lot of very, very competent people. My friend Al, of course, my friend Jay, my friend Charlie, right out here, my friend Roger, and here is George right there, and Ted over there, and let's see who else. Oh, a whole bunch of these people are all Radio Club members. So if you have an idea you'd like to become a part of the activity, we have applications for a few of you. I mean, meaning that's all the applications I have with me, but until they would run out, anyone who is interested, just see me or get to me. Is that what you want? And thank you an awful lot for putting up with us.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, one bit on to predicate Charlie Higginbottom, who is really a real personal friend of mine, even though I had many friends in the commission, but today the commission doesn't work like it did then. And Charlie is telling you the story between politics and regulatory. It is split, just like that. However, when 27 megahertz was called out, I was totally against what is connotated as Class D CB because I knew there would be skip. And that was one of my big arguments, is why go to 27 if we want short-range personal radio? Shortly after that, I don't mind telling you, I received my membership application from the ARL back as being the instigator of 27 megahertz. So I want to tell you the story behind the story, because I never rejoined ARL after that. But the manufacturers were up in arms to get low-cost equipment out to the public. And there was a lot of pressure on by those manufacturers. They're the ones that mandated the opening of 27 megahertz Class D. I had nothing to do with it. I was totally against it. Charlie knows it. George Sterling knew it. The members of the commission knew it. But I'm only one man against a whole mob of manufacturers that want to put out today what is called in Europe the chicken band. CB is now all over the world, if you people don't know this, because I've been honored in Europe and in the Orient for... Nothing funny about that. I'll show you my itinerary. They paid for my trip over there. But the greatest honor I had was when the Italians, March 22nd, 1980, arranged to have me visit Pope John Paul in Rome, who wanted to see the original radios, which I had with me at that time, and I have photographs of that interlude. And shortly after that, Radio Club of America was kind enough to that year. Radio Club of America made me a fellow, but it had nothing to do with my visit to the Pope. But that was a great honor because I learned that at the age of 24 in Poland, he had taken an interest in amateur radio. So he had a background and knew full well what it was, and I had the opportunity of being his guest. Thank you.
Al, thank you very much. What we're going to do is set the table back down. If you see folks taking a look at the rest of the stuff, I want to get some pictures myself. I hope you enjoyed this evening. Good night.
I got it.
There with the edge there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will. See you later. You guys go. All right, we'll talk. Give me a ring. I have them. And you can take all the copies. Yeah, that's like the magazine.